steps are you taking to promote peace building?
Well, basically what I've been talking with people about is obviously you can't force change upon people for a start. All you can do is encourage them with some logical thinking. So in this discussion you can see that my logic is fairly flawless when it comes to the examination of things like our belief in a wrathful God and what that justifies, our belief in what happened in our childhood and our acceptance of a wrathful God. We can see the interrelationships of all of these things. Now, all these things need to be said, and said by more than one person. Now, of course, not many people on the planet are willing to say these things because it confronts the whole concept of family, parenting. It confronts religions of all kinds, not just the Christian faith or the Muslim faith, but all forms of religion on the planet are going to be confronted by the different statements. And so very few people are willing to stick their neck on the line and say, look, all of these things are out of harmony with love, and this is the reason why. So the first thing that we're willing to do with our personal life is to stick our neck out on the line and go, no, all these things are out of harmony in love, and this is the reason why. Secondly, we want to address this underlying reason why we accept things out of harmony with love, which has to do with this relationship between parental training of acceptance of violence in the child. And we want to talk about that and work our way through that emotionally. We've got to get to the point where we forgive the parent, which means going through a whole series of feelings about what the parent's done towards us. To get to the point of forgiveness, we need to get to the point of forgiving the parent for what they've done, and therefore we'll be able to forgive society for what it does to us that's out of harmony with love as well. So in other words, we'll be able to act in harmony with love with everyone around us without, when it's immaterial what they do to us. So they still might attack us, but we'll act in harmony with love every time because we've forgiven, because we've automatically gone through this process where we've developed our love enough, where we've exceeded the basic principle of eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, which, as Gandhi said, makes all of us blind, right? And we've exceeded that definition of love to the point where we go, no, I'm going to forgive any unloving act towards myself. So what Mary and myself do is we personally practice that, but also we teach that for free to anybody who will listen. And we do interviews like the one you're doing now to anybody who will listen, who wants to talk about it. We do presentations for free to anybody who will listen. Now, the way we live is that people donate to us because they appreciate the material that they've heard. But we only have a little box up the back that they can donate to. That's how we live. We actually believe in what we preach, and we actually practice what we preach as well. So I feel what it needs initially is firstly one person to believe this underlying principles about what is true with regard to God and with regard to love. And then eventually they will infect, through a process of discussion, other people and inspire other people to do exactly the same thing. And eventually more and more people will inspire other people, and eventually it will become some kind of movement. Now, I wouldn't call it a religious movement because it's not about religion. It's about love. It's sort of like it's better, it to me is more of a societal movement that needs to occur, where we all eventually get to the point where we decide, yes, this way of living, this loving way of living, this non-violent way of living, even in the family, because this is where the violence starts, a non-violent way of living is the best way of living. And we've got to give up all of these belief systems that we have that cause us to believe that violence is something to resort to under certain circumstances. Now I believe once enough people logically understand that, and they can be atheists or religions of any kind, you can all understand that, and once enough people understand that, then it'll be like it'll just be a movement that just catches a light on the planet and moves the planet into a new place of peace. And so I believe very strongly that we are capable of having peace on earth and goodwill towards all men, as the Bible actually says.
Yes.
And I believe very strongly, though, that it needs to be done in the hearts of men. You know, And quite often I said to people in the first century, look, you listen to me, but your hearts are unresponsive. And really, for us to all change in love, the heart has to become responsive. The heart has to go, oh yeah, hang on a second, I do not want to be this unloving person anymore that I've become. I can see why I've become it, and that's all to do with the past, and it's all to do with how my parents treated me and how the environment treated me and what that caused me to justify. It all has to do with my belief systems about God and my belief systems about what's the right religion and all these things. Once I give up all of that, and I'm not saying you have to give up all the religion, but you need to give up the unloving belief systems. And that's going to be emotional. It's going to take some emotional work. You know, you can't just do it in your head. You're going to have to change it in your heart somehow. And that's going to be releasing the beliefs that you have that are out of harmony with love, so that you can accept the beliefs that are in harmony with love. Once a lot of people decide to do that on the planet, and then a movement slowly grows where that occurs, then you'll see huge changes on the planet, I believe. And I believe huge changes are possible on the planet. And the reason why myself and Mary are here again is because we believe the planet's ripe for that kind of change. But it can't be forced upon people. It has to come from within them. Yeah.
Now you mentioned a movement of love, so a love movement kind of reminds me of like the 60s, I'd say. So would you equate this new movement sort of to the hippies and...
No, the hippie movement was very unloving. It firstly had a lot of sexual unloving things occurring. It was often addicted to drugs, which was also quite unloving to the individual. And in addition, it was more of a rebellion against authority. And rebellion against authority is not a love towards authority. So you know, I cannot define the 60s as a loving movement that occurred. Now, sure, certain things changed in the 60s that were more loving. You know, there were more countries that accepted women as equals to men, although you'd have to ask how well that's really taken on, considering even in the most developed of Western countries, for most of them, women are still paid less than men. So, you know, you'd have to consider whether some of these movements have had a really long-lasting effect yet on the planet. But there certainly were changes that were positive in that regard. You know, a good change was that there's far less sexual control over women. So that is a good change. A negative change is that the less sexual control resulted in a bit of a backlash where women became more promiscuous, and I don't think that was a very good change. So I feel there were positive changes and negative changes, as there are in almost every generation. But if we asked ourselves, if this generation asked itself, how are we going to become more loving, then I'm sure we can see that there'd be a much more positive change. And particularly if we were willing to address within our hearts the reason why we're unloving. You see, many people in the 60s, for example, thought the war in Vietnam was in error. But they were willing to be violent in their protest towards the war in Vietnam. So the war in Vietnam was violent, and they resorted to violence to stop the violence. And that's not a loving act. You can't resort to violence and hope that violence stops, because violence perpetrates violence. Historically, we know this now for generations, that violence perpetrates more violence. So we can't expect to stop violence by rebelling against a violent act by becoming violent ourselves. So these were mistakes that were made in the 60s, I believe. But there were also some good changes that occurred in the same era, because people started to see inequality. And inequality is never a positive thing for the earth or for any person on it. Even the people who have an excess, it's not good for them to have inequality, because they then develop arrogance and they develop this idea that they are superior to others, and that causes them to act then in violent ways towards others because they believe themselves to be better. So having too much or too little is also a problem, either direction. We are able to generate societies and politics that are not communistic in their nature, but actually do support the free will of the individual, but also include love in the entire politics. And at the moment that's not seen on the planet either, but that is also possible. there is enough intelligent people on the planet. You know, you're going to university, you know, the room is probably full of intelligent people.
Yes.
There's enough intelligent people on the planet for us to change. The key is whether we badly want to or not. Really, so it gets down to our underlying personal motivations. Are we willing to actually change our personal life in the direction that we feel the world should change? And that's the thing that myself and Mary are attempting to do, to change our personal life in the same direction that we would like to see the world to change. And we feel that if we do these things strongly enough and with enough motivation, and our motivation has to be based upon love, then sooner or later people will listen rather than just attack. You know, so we've been accused many times of being like leaders of a cult or some kind of religion or whatever, none of which is true. You know, as you can see in our house here, we've got no fences or gates or whatever else, and you walked in the front and there was no fences in the front. We've got a little 2-bedroom house of our own. We're not into having huge amounts of money. If I did have huge amounts of money, I know where I'd go and spend it. And, you know, and it would be to help a lot of these problems on the planet. But the reality is, you can see from the way that, even just by visiting us once, by the way we live our life, we're not bossing people around, telling them what to do. We're just suggesting that if we want this world to become more loving, we've got to give up the belief systems about God that are unloving. We've got to give up our personal belief systems, whether they're religious or family-based or not, doesn't really matter, that are unloving. And we've got to start to accept more loving belief systems as an emotional process. Once we do that, these emotions of love will drive our nature. And once they drive our nature, we will be loving to other people around us. They will feel our love and then feel like they would like to do the same thing to others. And eventually you have this growing, and for the sake of a term, I can't call it anything other than just a movement, if you call it that,
Of course.
a groundswell of people who have decided to love rather than to live in violence and rather to live in fear. And so rather than doing that, they want to love. And I feel once we do that, and I'm not talking here about free sexual love, I'm talking about the real love that comes when I treat you as I would like to be treated. That kind of love. And once we all decide to act in harmony with that principle, this world will be a much better place to live in.
Of course.
Yeah.